Attorney Phil Jusino, and this is the Phil Jusino Show. My special guest tonight is Attorney John Ray, and we will be discussing the Gilgo Beach murders. Welcome aboard, John.
Thank you, Phil. Good evening.
John has been involved in this case for about 13 years, and he represents victims and families of victims. John, 13 years, that's an incredible journey.
Sure is.
Can you give my audience a little bit of an overview? We've all heard, if you live on Long Island, you've all heard about the Gilgo Beach murders. There's been an arrest recently. Give us a little bit of an overview on how you became involved.
Well, I became involved coincidentally, actually, in that I was on a Medford pharmacy murder case that took place here.
That.
5 people were assassinated, and one of them was her children were victims, of course. They lost their mother, and I was their lawyer at the sentencing to speak for them. So when I did, one of the reporters approached me after the sentencing and asked me to help out with a woman named Mary Gilbert. And I met her in Islip with the reporter Steve Barcelo from the Daily News. And we agreed that I would help her just for one thing, to help her with the press conference that we would call to ask the police to step aside because they had bungled the job very badly by then, and instead to allow the FBI to come in. And that was all my only role. That was all it was supposed to be. So I had that press conference at Oak Beach, and then the police saw fit to write me a letter, a private letter on police union stationery by one of the homicide detectives who was investigating the case, to tell me I was all wet about the things I had said. And in particular, he revealed what he said was on the 911 telephone call that Shannon had made for 23 minutes when she was in desperate fear for her life.
Right.
And he said that everybody on that tape was calm, and that including Shannon, and that nobody was upset, and that there was no threats, and that she was not in any danger.
I remember that was a point of contention, but how did you know early on that the investigation was initially bungled? How did you know?
I had been reading the stories that had been coming out about the police investigation, and it was fairly obvious it was not being done right. I mean, for one thing, for example, the police commissioner, at that time a fellow named Dormer,
Richard Dormer,
made a speech in which he said that Shannon had drowned and they hadn't yet found the body. I don't know how they could conclude that.
Yeah. How could they come up with that?
There was no way to do that, except that they wanted you to think that without evidence.
Why do you think that?
Well, they didn't have any evidence other than that she was likely killed. And for reasons that were not then known or explained, they didn't want anybody to think that she was murdered. So they did exactly what homicide people never do, and that is they relied upon theory instead of evidence. There was no evidence that anything happened to her except murder. And nonetheless, they came up with this bizarre theory. And then when they found her jeans, pocketbook, and cell phone laying in a semicircle, more or less, behind houses, the house of a man named Peter Hackett, in the marsh, Dormer made a speech when he was asked by a reporter, how did her jeans come off? And he said that, well, there were bramble bushes that pulled them off as she ran through the marsh. Well, you know that's absurd. You know their position was absurd. And the idea that she would have called 911 when she was a sex worker, something that they don't do, she had a great deal of desperation. It was very hard to believe that um, that nobody was feeling any threats, or everybody was calm on the 911 tape. In addition, this guy, Dr. Peter Hackett, had emerged, and he was said to be, responsible for her death. And he claimed he made some bizarre phone calls, and the police covered him completely.
I remember in an
Didn't make
interview.
any sense.
Doesn't. You gave an interview and you said the police acted in complete isolation. And I know that they didn't want the FBI to come in. I think you blamed Burke for that. And in fact, you had said turf obsessed and didn't want another agency to get credit.
That was at least the truth. Turns out, I think there might be more heinous reasons for that truth. But there's no doubt that Burke, who was then the chief of police,
James Burke.
all right, and even before he was chief of police, when he's chief of detectives in the DA's office, he did everything he could.
Very close with Spoda.
Very close with Thomas Spoda, yes. He did everything he could to frustrate the investigation, shut it down, and isolate it from all other police agencies that existed that were involved. And that included the Jersey City Police Department Missing Persons Bureau, because Shannon Gilbert was a resident of Jersey City. And so they came into it, and their Detective Cesar Camacho, did a fabulous job of investigating the case right away. They cut him off. He was pushed away.
What about the driver who drove Shannon Gilbert, let's say, to that job that evening? What was his role? Did they interview him? I would assume they had.
That's Michael Pack you're speaking about.
Yes.
And Michael Pack was a felon, convicted felon for human trafficking, dealing with people coming from the Far East. And he worked for an organization which was known as an agency. An agency is a nice little word and a euphemism for a sex trafficking organization. And he worked for them. And he was working for them on the night that Shannon disappeared. So he played a heavy role in this, and yet the police never arrested him, even though Shannon had left Jersey City, crossed state lines,
FBI.
for the purposes of sex work, and engaged in it. And he took her, and yet he was never arrested. And the police credited his testimony to them, and I don't even know if it was testimony, but statements, and never looked twice.
Now, you said you got involved about 13 years ago. When you first got involved, did you ever think that it would take about 13 or so years before an arrest was made? I know you saw early on there were problems, but did you think it would take that long?
Yeah, I thought it would take a long time to get any justice or any fairness done here.
Did you have concerns that there would never be an arrest?
Yes, I thought there's a really strong possibility that nobody would ever have been arrested, knowing what I knew. So it was not a surprise when they made an arrest, because about a week before that, I had gotten a tip that they were going to make the arrest. And that tipster was a very solid individual. And sure enough, they did, but I didn't know who the man was going to be. And that was a surprise.
So he was not on anybody's radar, at least as far as you knew.
Hoyerman was not on my radar, and I doubt that he was on the police radar, the official police anyway, the ones who were actually doing the work, at all. He might have been on the radar of certain people, as in they didn't want him to emerge.
Let's go back to the beginning of the investigation. So they find a body, right? And they found more than one body, at least initially.
They found one body at a time. In what's the lawyers say, in seriatim, in order. They found bodies, and each time they found a body, they had been looking for Shannon, but instead it turned out to be somebody else. Although they would notify Mary Gilbert that they thought they found Shannon over and over again. It was torture for her.
So why do you think, and I know you said it could be more heinous, but what do you think the main reason was that the police didn't look either to Jersey or the FBI? Why wouldn't you bring in an agency like the FBI to help you out?
Well, the police don't agree with that point of view. They say they did bring in the FBI, and there's truth in that, but it's not the round truth. It's not the whole truth.
What is the truth?
The truth is the FBI played a passive role, um, relatively passive. They did send a helicopter over the marsh and didn't see anything, which is kind of surprising given that Shannon's body was laying in the marsh openly, uh, but they didn't see it. So either it really wasn't there yet when they put the helicopter up, or they just overlooked it for reasons unknown. Um, but so they did do that, and they did some preliminary lab type work. I mean, you might call it lab work. I don't know what you would call it. Sort of, doing profiling, that sort of thing.
Right.
They did that kind of work, but they weren't out walking the beat. They weren't knocking on doors. They weren't digging into the raw evidence. That wasn't happening. They were
Would
kept
they
out.
would they have done that if the Suffolk County PD wanted them or asked them to? In other words, more of an active role.
It's hard to know what the FBI would have done, but they were certainly made. It was made certain that they couldn't play a role, no matter what, and that
By
was
the
done by
SCPD.
Burke
Yes.
and Spoda, and there's no question of that. In fact, the commissioner, the lady commissioner, what's her name? I'm sorry about memories on names, but um, the woman that resigned, she even said that it was Spoda and Burke who had blocked the FBI from coming into the case. So you have to take them at their word, the commissioner.
So those two are running the show initially, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I Spoda seemed to play he was a pulling guard, so to speak, for Burke, and he was able to use his authority to block the FBI. But it was Burke who was the source of that, from what I understand, and the source of the desire to block all other
Hmm.
agencies, keep them out.
Do you think Burke had knowledge, greater knowledge than he let on? Let's say, or he had some involvement in it, possibly.
When I first got into the case, the answer is not so easy. I was told that
Nothing's easy about this case.
not a single thing is easy about this case. That's for sure, Phil. Um, I was told by many others that Burke was the key. Burke was in the case, and just watch what Burke does, and so on.
I've heard that through the years.
We've all heard it. I didn't believe it. From the evidence I had, it didn't seem to point directly at him. Yeah, there was a lot of vague inferences and what have you, but that's not evidence. That's speculation, and speculation is worthy. Speculation is useful.
Well, you can build on it.
All right. Same with inference, which is a similar thing, but that's not evidence. And so being naturally skeptical from my work, um, I didn't buy it, and I waited to see what would develop. There were little circumstantial pieces of evidence that started to fall into place, but they still didn't add up to
Right.
Burke. And um, and I maintained that against those who were insisting on it. Otherwise, when they had no evidence, nobody had any evidence to pin Burke. And,
Even still.
well, yeah, okay, but uh, in fact, I think it was true to say that several of the police officials were saying that there was no evidence, that they weren't even looking at him anymore. Um, but that's shifted.
But why do you think Spoda was complicit in the sense to not let other agencies? And he was the DA. He was the DA of Suffolk County, and you'd think you'd want to solve this crime, and you do whatever you have to do legally to do it. If you could bring it, like you said, Jersey, there was a resource there. That why do you think? Do you think he just relied heavily on what Burke wanted to do, or was there some other reason?
I no longer have an answer for your question. I would once have said, to my mind, Spoda is not not the kind of person that would be involved in um, the sort of nefarious things that have gone on in this case.
Or maybe covering for somebody that did.
I still don't think he'd be doing anything heinous in that regard. But his desire and his actions matched in that isolate everybody and keep this in the hands of Burke. And knowing who Burke was,
Right.
and Spoda had to know who he had there as his chief, or as the chief of the police, not his chief, but
And they go way back
they go way back, all right.
to the Pius case.
You just know I'm my confidence in skepticism about this is really shaken. I mean, when Burke goes up on the hill here, in Bald Hill,
Right?
and asks to give oral sex to a man,
Makes you think.
when he knows, by the way, that hill is notorious for that sort of behavior, so that the cops are there. I've myself represented people who got busted up there for the same thing.
He
So,
knew.
and
Why
Burke
such
was,
risky behavior?
yeah, I mean, Burke was considered to be one of the best, most knowledgeable street cops when he was out, working the tough areas like Amityville, and his record says so in the disciplinary record that he had in the police department. So if he knew that, and he knew the street, he knew that hill. Everybody knew that hill and what was going on there. And then to go up and take that risk, he was a man who just loved risk, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He was a man that delved into every kind of deviousness, perhaps, that we can imagine. For example, consider that with that behavior and with Burke's predilection for female sex workers as well, mix that together, what do you have? You have a pervert at a major scale. And where are his lines and limits? Doesn't seem like they exist. So, if you eliminate the lines and the limits, so to speak, the restraints,
Anything's possible.
the civilized restraints, anything's possible.
Right.
Which then takes my mind all the way back to the Pius case. And I never sat comfortably thinking, in that case, watching that case develop, as a young lawyer forward, I never bought the explanation that somehow this little boy was murdered because he was going to rat the other kids
A
on
mini bike worth about
a
$5.
mini bike and burglaries in a house or houses, which Burke himself was involved with because he was the friend of this group. He wasn't a distant friend. He was an intimate friend of these people.
I was in Boy Scouts with the quarter. I knew that group. I was in the Boy Scouts with the Quartereros. John Pius played Little League. I grew up in Smithtown.
Oh, okay.
So Burke graduated from Smithtown East in '82. I graduated from Smithtown West in '82.
Okay.
So years later, I knew people that knew him.
Right.
He was a trouble kid.
He was a troublemaker. He was a trouble kid with serious criminal behavior.
And
So
Burke Spoda takes him under his wing.
Yeah, well, that makes me wonder again why this little boy was murdered. I think that has to be revisited. In light of the sexual behavior of Burke. Did that play some role? Was sex a role in this case?
He was a witness, supposedly.
Somebody needs to look at that, in my opinion.
Now, what do you think changed, and that Rex Heuermann was arrested recently? And I know they used some DNA and pizza, right? With some DNA. But what do you think changed? What was the mindset that changed, possibly, to steer them in that direction? Because you said it wasn't on your radar. It wasn't like sometimes you hear it might be this particular guy, and they just don't have the evidence, and then they get it. Here, I had never heard of that guy.
Well, you had some changes that took place in the bureaucracy, which is almost unchangeable. So for change to take place, that's a major development. And the police are, after all, a bureaucracy. And that change took place when Rodney Harrison became the commissioner, and when
Didn't he recently leave did he just recently leave the office?
Yes.
and there's some issues.
I don't think there's any serious issues with him. He's a good man.
Or they're investigating a timesheets or something like that.
Well, they is Ray Tierney's office,
DA,
the
right.
DA's office, and he's doing what duty, I guess, calls, because there's a politician who accused Rodney of wrongdoing in using his timesheets. And just reading it on the story on its face, and you never know the real story or the whole story. You know, I don't know who in insidious little blankety blank in the bureaucracy decided to try to get his boss in trouble. But I don't have any sense that anything criminal took place
And that's
whatsoever.
peripheral to this whole.
It's complete fake.
Right.
You know, uh, it's a twisted salute to a guy who did a great job. And the other factor was Ray Tierney coming in as the DA.
Right.
You know, he comes in, he's going to clean house, and he's going to do it right, and he did. They put those two guys together, and they came up with a team. They called it the task force. And one of the things they did, I think, which was really important, is bringing in New York State Police for the first time to work on the case they should have been working on for years.
Right.
And the very first thing they did when they put the state on is they got themselves a woman to look at the case. She's the one that broke the case on the, on the DNA and all that. It was a woman.
So how
They
did
didn't have any women in there of any significance playing any great role in the investigation. Look at all the homicide cops; they were all men.
But how did that lead to Rex Uerman? How did that?
I don't think we'll ever, we'll wait for the true story to unfold over the years. But looks like it was putting together the information that they had from a pinging of telephone calls that were made by the murderer.
The vehicle? Didn't they have an idea of the vehicle?
Well, that's separate from the pinging of the towers. There's the towers. When you make a cell phone call, your phone pings off of a tower and goes to another tower. And they were able to trace some of the killer's phone calls because he had made calls to some of the victims' families. One with the victim's phone, right? Melissa Barthelemy's phone. So they were able to narrow down where the phone calls would have come from, which gave them a geographic area. And then they also had, apparently, sitting in their files, evidence of an avalanche having been driven, a Chevy, I think it is, having been driven by the guy who showed up at Amber Costello's door, and one of the victims. And they were able to put these two together by saying, well, we have a geographic area where the pinging took place. We'll carve that out, make a square out of that, and we'll go and we'll see how many people in that area had avalanches.
But when did they first have this information? How many years ago?
Well, the avalanche information came right away, from what I understand. They had it by 2011.
What about the pinging?
All right, the pinging likewise was early on. Because that's the kind of work they can do technologically and trace it.
So it sounds like if Ray Tierney, let's say, didn't put that task force together, a new commissioner, that woman, what was her title?
She was some kind of a technological person that dealt with doing pings, doing the phone research.
So fresh eyes.
Fresh eyes. Yeah.
Really was, because otherwise, if that didn't change, we'd be sitting here talking about Rex Uerman in all likelihood.
Well, I'm not so sure I agree with that, only in that, what is the future would have held is the question, I guess. And the answer is that Rex Uerman was a very reckless guy, as was his wife, and is his wife. And it's what I call an evil miracle that he wasn't caught before all this, just for his own behavior.
Now, do you think he has two grown children, right? Yeah. And his wife?
Well, he has one grown child. One is his stepchild.
Okay. But two grown children lived in that house. Two young adults.
More than two grown children lived in that 1,343 square foot house with a basement that's part of that number. And so this was nothing more than a exaggerated bungalow by any standard. And there were several people who lived in that
So
house.
they had to have
They,
some kind of knowledge of what was going on
oh,
there.
indeed, you know,
Hmm.
I don't know how you could miss what was going on, whatever was going on in that house.
Hmm.
Be virtually impossible.
But they're playing it like they don't know anything.
You mean the wife
The
and
wife, yeah.
yeah, the wife is full of inconsistencies, which is not a good thing to be if you claim you're innocent.
Right. So I'm just looking at some questions. Somebody said he was a man who had a duffel bag stolen from his car. Well, that was Burke.
Right.
And that's how everything started to unfold some years ago. It says the phone records evidence that led to the arrest directly. Uh, what would you say was the most damning evidence in the so far that came out? And he told about the pinging, the car. Well, the DNA is very strong
The DNA is not as strong as you'd like it to be, and that's usually the case with DNA when it gets challenged. So to rely on DNA alone is not a wise idea. Um, that that can be a problem. Look at this Petrov today. He was back in court because of I don't know exactly what happened yet. I'm waiting to find out, but they brought him all the way down from Comstock to appear in court in front of Judge Ambrose today. So he was convicted on DNA. I read the papers that were filed on in his case because I had met with the family a long time ago and understood their case, and he had a good appeal, and that the Legal Aid Society did a fabulous job on the appeal, and it's a strong appeal. So why? Because they convicted him on DNA, and that's usually not enough by itself.
Okay, but juries love to see DNA because to them, it's almost solid proof.
Well, they didn't see it in OJ's case, did they?
No, that was an unusual case. Yeah,
True,
anybody else would have been convicted 100 times over.
perhaps, but it was DNA that was the issue, and one of the issues. And so DNA is a very nice piece of science to use for the prosecution in many cases, and it's not irrefutable, but it's strong. But strong isn't sometimes enough.
Right, but
And
here you said they have the pinging, so they can get a geographic area.
yeah, there's other evidence,
Other
and we
evidence
don't
here.
know what their evidence is from the things they seized in the house.
Sure.
They've never revealed that.
Right, we're not going to know everything. And Ray Tierney himself is going to try the case. That's been reported.
Yep, he is. Sounds to me like he's a great guy and he's a great lawyer.
I know.
I've worked with him before on other cases, and he's a good, solid guy. But he takes the risk that if something goes wrong in that trial, one juror balks, and there's a hung jury, that's a loss.
I guess he feels he's got a strong case.
I guess so. But this I don't know enough about the science without having it in front of me
Mm-hmm.
to fight it in court. I've had DNA cases, but there's a distinction between traditional DNA, shall we call it, and this so-called mitochondrial DNA, which puts you in a group of people. It can narrow down the number of people who could be at the scene of the crime to a few thousand or a few hundred, maybe.
Right.
But it doesn't narrow it down to you if you're a defendant. And that's the kind
And
of DNA they have.
That
So
can be reasonable doubt. That's all.
it's an issue.
That's all you need. Now you had made a quote. It said, "The light that it brings also casts a shadow over past work of the police department that we always said was the problem and inadequate." I found that interesting because Mike Brown is the attorney, the defense attorney.
Good lawyer.
Good lawyer, excellent. I know him very well. Do you think that I think the answer is yes, that he would use a lot of those things through the years to show reasonable doubt?
I believe he should. And if I were on his team, that's the direction I would go.
A lot of
There are-
ammunition.
There's a lot of ammunition for other people who could be responsible for this, not least of whom would be Horriman's brother.
Really?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, DNA between brothers, sometimes, a brother will test, one person will test out to be, say, 98% certain to be the person associated with the DNA, but the brother that takes the test, and he's 87%. So
And where does he live?
Well, he lives down south, but he had an avalanche.
And did he live in the
And
area during that
well, he
time?
lived in the house. He actually lived in that house.
That hasn't been reported as much because I've read a number of articles. I haven't read that.
Well, he did. It's there.
Interesting.
So those are kinds of things. If you're the defense, you're going to raise that
Sure.
issue. You know, the odd twist is he doesn't have. Um, Mike doesn't have the resources of the DA, and he's been inundated with documents, thousands and thousands of documents he has to read through and put together a defense from that. That is one hell of a job he has to do. But I think he tried his first actual jury trial against me many years ago in Southampton, and I had nothing but the greatest regard for him. He's a good kid, and he's a good guy.
He's a prosecutor at the time?
He was a prosecutor at the time, and it was a misdemeanor of a family fight, and I was the defense lawyer, and he beat me fair and square, and I thought he did a good job. And
It's funny. Years ago, I had a client. It was a divorce case, and Mike's client killed my client and her mother, stabbed him to death in Bayshore. It was in the papers. You might have heard about it years ago. So Mike got the case, and I spent 2 days in Riverhead, and I was a potential witness because before he killed him, he called me.
Oh, wow.
He
Okay.
didn't have an attorney. He kept saying she's cheating on me, and I said I can't help you out. Get an attorney, and he hangs up the phone with me, drives over to Bayshore, the house, goes in, gets a knife from the butcher block, chases my client and her mother out the front door. It was sad. The mother was there. My client's mother was there to protect her. So he stabs them both, goes in the house full of blood, and says goodbye to his 8-year-old son and his 10-year-old son. And I was there because Mike had an insanity defense. And I was there because I was going to testify as to the nature of the phone call, but they didn't need my testimony. So Mike almost had a chance to cross-examine me. But,
Oh, wow.
but I was not called. And the sad part of that case, the kids got shipped to Virginia to a family they didn't really know because Grandpa was too old to take care of them. Grandma was killed. Dad's in jail, and Mom was killed.
Very sad. Very awful.
That was a long time ago. Now, but what we were talking briefly about the wife and all of that. To what extent do you think? What knowledge do you think she has? She witnessed certain things.
Well, the particular knowledge she had isn't yet known.
Who was her attorney?
Robert Macedonia.
Oh, I know. Okay. Who used to be a
He's
partner
a
with
former
Mike.
partner of Mike.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And
He's doing her divorce, I believe, too.
he is the divorce attorney. I don't know that he's the attorney for anything else.
Okay.
Although he seems like he is because he acts like he is.
Mm-hmm.
But he's never said that. So I'm curious about that relationship. But what was your question?
Is it? Do you think she has knowledge that could, let's say, be beneficial for the prosecution to use against her husband? That she doesn't have to testify.
The chances are pretty strong that she has guilty knowledge. She should be considered a suspect inherently. She's home with this guy for 27 years, and all the depredations that took place during that period. Her DNA is on the hairs found on the bodies.
Right.
That inherently would make her a suspect, in my view, even if she claims an alibi.
What about the other? What about the other adult children?
Well,
Dan, can you take it? Excuse us.
it's okay.
The other adult children that were there, you said there were at least 2 or 3?
There were other adults in that house, according to the records I have. That they all claim to have lived there right up until, at least some of them did, right up until he's arrested. So there are other, factors. There are other people here. I don't know yet. Completely know their roles. I hope the police are looking at that.
They might be afraid. Well, he's in jail, but still, they might have been afraid through the years to come to call the authorities.
They might have been afraid, and they might be part of it. Who knows? that is why these people should be in the circle of, what do the police like to call it? People of interest. And then when they move in a tighter circle,
Right.
suspects. They belong in those two circles, these people. And they need to be looked at to see what do they know. I mean, when there's a car accident, or what do the police do when they arrive at the scene? They get every witness, they take down what they say. You know, why is it any different than a criminal case? And why would these people be therefore ignored? Makes no sense.
Do you know if they were interviewed?
I know up until recently, the mother and the children had not been interviewed.
I wonder why that is.
I don't know.
Like you said, look, I'm a former prosecutor. I don't know if you were, but
No, I never was.
You were, handling criminal cases for many, many years.
Yeah.
Like you said, you get to the scene and you start questioning people. Now they can plead the fifth.
That's different. They can plead husband-wife privileges. They have all kinds of things that they can plead. But you have to get them to that point where that happens, right? I mean, isn't that fundamental?
Box them in.
Fundamental work. And they had alibis, or had an alibi, or maybe alibis. I think three of them for three of the victims. Supposedly the mother was away on vacation,
Right.
Perhaps with the children. But the vacation spots are fairly fungible. One's in Iceland. That's about as close as you're going to get plane-wise back to the States. One vacation was in New Jersey, not too far from the Long Island shore. And one of them, I believe, was in Virginia, but it could have been one of the other middle states. I'm not sure. And I think when I read the indictment more carefully, it didn't say she was on vacation. It said the cell phone was in places where she would have been on vacation.
And then didn't they look into bodies that may have been discovered in those areas where he was, out of the state?
Well, we heard that they looked into places like Las Vegas. We don't know what the result of that is yet.
Hasn't been reported.
No, but there are other places too, where he seems to have been widely traveled, and he threw a wide net around out into the world of places that he would go and properties that he would own. I mean, we know he was in Virginia. He traveled there often.
Something
I think
in
his
Vegas,
family
yeah.
member is there. Las Vegas, he has a condo. He has a place up in just north of Boston in the woods.
What struck me as odd is
New
when it was
Jersey.
first reported, you got the impression he was a prosperous man. And then you look at that house. It's incongruous to a successful engineer. Was he an engineer or architect?
Architect.
Architect, like George Costanza, an architect. He was an architect, and he worked in Manhattan, dressed well. You see him in the suits. And then he had that house.
Well, he's also in deep tax debt, he and his wife. So when people were giving to the GoFundMe for his wife, I can't even imagine why they would do that.
What would they do?
She has a big tax debt, a tax lien that could be slapped on any money she gets. So they had a huge tax debt, and they had other debts as well, and they were involved in certain scams. It looks like they were involved in fake car accidents and things to get insurance. So what was all the hustle for the money, and where did it all go? One potential insight I think you have is that he's got a condo in Las Vegas. There's a reason for that. And there's somebody that came forward recently from Mohegan, what is that called up in Connecticut?
Mohegan Sun.
Mohegan Sun, thank you. And she was one of these croupiers there, and he would sit for hours at her table. And she became nervous. She said he made her very uncomfortable. But the latter point in that, the 2 points, is that he was there for hours. Now, I mean, I'm sure that ordinary people sit there and they pull the levers on the slot machines and things like that. But to sit for hours at a table, a gambling table, tells me you're a gambler. And that may be where the money was going. That and sex. He, from the evidence I have, there's an overwhelming number of women he used, sex workers that he paid for.
Did they trace anything through credit cards?
I don't know. That I couldn't answer.
Because I would think some of that stuff is paid with credit cards.
Yeah, if you're going to pay for through these what do they call them again? I use the word. Um, uh, these sex trafficking organizations, they call agencies. They take credit cards. So, if you're going to make a deal, you're going to make it through them on a credit card, and that could be traced.
I would think.
Yeah,
So they might have it. They're not letting on.
they might.
Okay. Now, as far as your representation, victims, families, that's civil. So what do you hope to get out of that? What is the money?
No money involved in that.
No.
Never was.
So what are you trying to? How are you helping these people? What is your goal?
My goal is to get to the truth in these cases, and I started out with a very modest, limited goal of helping out Mary Gilbert, and then expanded into the Shannon Gilbert case, and helping the whole Gilbert family, and even Sarah when she insanely killed her poor mom. Became her lawyer for that, and my goal was to help them get to the truth, and still is. And that's what I'm trying to do with all these people who are calling me and giving me information. Get to the truth. That's it.
Do you think a conviction here will do that, or they'll still will remain unanswered questions?
Anything that happens in this case, because of the mess that this case became from the beginning forward, with the work and the bad work of the police department back then and all the way up until the task force, any of that work has so spoiled the what should we call it, the playing ground of truth, the field of truth, that even if somebody like this man is convicted, it will be a case like the extra bullet that supposedly killed Kennedy, or who is the real killer of Jack the Ripper, and the debate over that for even now going on, even when they think they know who he is. Well, but there's still a debate about those kinds of things, and there's all kinds of historical cases like that where people are just not convinced of the legal truth that took place through a conviction, a murder conviction. And that's what you have here, because there's so many different people killed in different ways.
Well, that was my next
Nobody's
question.
going to believe that they've gotten everybody, even if they've gotten everybody they think they have.
Like the MO. I know that there was some burlap bags and all of that. Do you think that some of the victims they've uncovered had nothing to do with Rex Heuermann?
It's possible, but it's growing less likely over time as I'm getting more information. His modus operandi is emerging, and it looks to me more likely than not that one of his modus operandi is to kill people miscellaneously. In other words, he didn't have a particular. He maybe he strangled some of them, and others he might have done other worse things than that, and so forth. His lack of pattern is a
Makes it more
pattern.
difficult.
Is a pattern in its own right, if you follow me. So that's a thought anyway. I don't know. I mean,
But that area could be a dumping ground. Other people, just like there's like mob dumping ground, and you don't know.
except it's a graveyard of sex workers, and they're similarly killed in groups, beheaded, chopped up, strangled, suffocated, all laying in a fairly elongated graveyard in the same place, and they're all with the same profession.
How many bodies have they uncovered?
11. But there are others in Manorville who are unidentified males that may be related, and the police have never said. And I've actually sued them to get information on one of those bodies, a man, and I was refused that by the police, claiming it's an active investigation.
Now in Gilgo, wasn't there one male that was a victim?
Yeah, there's one
Asian
young Asian male, but his face was bashed in. So they say, well, that's a different form of killing, so he doesn't count. But he was a cross-dresser, And so the chances are pretty strong that there's a sexual motive involved in this, just like there were with the sex workers, or a motive that dealt with sex, not necessarily a sexual motive.
Okay. Now you said there were bodies found in Manorville. How many?
There were two others that were found in Manorville, not too far away from.
And they think they're connected?
I think they might be connected. That's why I sought, by way of an Article 78 proceeding, special proceeding, I sought to get the information about one of them, and I was denied. So,
Do you have any idea why you were denied?
yeah, there was a claim that there was an open, active investigation, and so I wasn't allowed to have the material.
But nothing's been reported lately?
I haven't, seen anything reported on it lately, on that. But I'm looking, as you can tell.
Sure.
I try to put my money where my mouth is. I do the work. I was asked by somebody who said, "Look, take a look at that body and look at the circumstances. What do you think?" We looked at it. We said, "Yeah, it looks. You've got a great point," and we went for it. I did the work. There's so many people that sit on the internet and they, they claim that they're putting in thousands of hours of work. That's not work. That's just curiosity and entertainment even.
Now, what have you, by being an attorney for some of the victims' families and so on, what do you have access to, let's say, that the average person might? Do you get to see autopsy reports?
In the civil cases that I've represented people, yes.
But would that require you starting a lawsuit to be able to request that documentation?
It depends. If you're representing a member of the family, for example, I was representing the Gilbert family when the autopsy was done on Shannon, and I went to the autopsy meeting with the family and members of my staff. Yeah, a while back in 2012, and I was given those documents that they were willing to release to me for them. So I did get that information, but not a lot of it. They kept most of it themselves and still do. And I was able to get the various autopsy reports that I've over the years gotten them dealing with other victims, but not in this case, in other cases. So
we only got about 2.5 minutes. I know there's going to be a trial, right? What information do you think you wish you had access to? Or what questions would you like to have answered?
From whom?
Either the police or any agency.
Well, that's a hard question, man. I hadn't thought of that. There's so much that still needs to be known. I'd like to see I've asked again for the evidence from the medical examiner's office regarding Shannon. I'd like to see some of the evidence they've gathered regarding Jessica Taylor. I'd like to see some of the evidence they've gathered in respect to Melissa Barthelemy, because I ended up representing a family up in Buffalo, New York, coincidentally, who came to me and asked me to help them because their daughter was found naked, upside down in a garbage can, frozen in Buffalo winter, and she was classified as having died by accident, by the accident of heroin, and she was a heroin addict. That was just so unlikely. In the way she ended up, she was very likely murdered, and it turned out that she was the co-worker of Melissa Barthelemy.
Wow.
So that just happened by coincidence. I don't think that coincidence for me to be looking at both cases, but it's not a coincidence that they're connected to each other.
You think they are?
Yeah.
In what way?
They were both sex workers. They went together to California to be trained in sex work.
One died.
Sex work is a highly organized business, and the one died up in Lockport in Buffalo, and Amanda Winchowski, her name was, and poor Amanda, beautiful girl, left like that.
Right, but when you say connected, maybe not necessarily Rex Uhrman.
I don't know about Rex Uhrman being in Buffalo one way or the other. We're looking at that. We know that Peter Hackett owned a home up there, owned property up there. We, we
Did
also,
Hackett know Uerman?
it's an open question right now. There seems to be some evidence in a broad sense that could connect them.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, because that name came up early on in the investigation.
Peter Hackett's
Yeah.
name? Yeah, it
I
sure did.
remember that name early on.
Yeah, well, he put himself into it by his bizarre behavior, which wasn't bizarre at all. It was the act of someone who is not innocent.
No. John, I really want to thank you for coming on my show
All
tonight.
right.
It was fascinating. And down the road, I could bring you back on if there's new developments. We could.
Yeah, sure, Phil.
We have cases against each other. So,
Yeah, we do.
We'll come across each other again. I'll see you soon.
All
Thank
right.
you very much, John.
All
You
right.
have
All
a
right.
good night. Thank
You
you.
too, Phil.
And I'd like to thank my audience for watching this show. If you miss it, obviously if you're watching it, you didn't. But any future shows, or you want it, maybe you caught the tail end of this show, you can go to YouTube. Daniel, what's the YouTube channel? The Phil Jusino Podcast. And also this show will be seen on Cablevision, channel 115 at 10 p.m. Not this Thursday, the following Thursday. You have a good night.